Now that we have a basic understanding of what territories are and why they're important, we're going to actually go ahead and build a basic interface with some simple data that shows a basic territory state-based example. And so this assumes that you've used MetaLocator before, maybe you've imported data in the past, and you understand generally how to use the software. If you're not clear on that yet, I encourage you to go watch some of our Getting Started videos before you dive into this part. The first thing we're going to do is look at some territory data. Now, a critical part of setting up territories involves specifying for your individual locations what their territories or service areas are. And so let's look at an example data file. So here I've switched over to Excel. And so I'd like to show you an example data file that has a very simple territory layout. And so we see we have a few locations here, sample locations 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And they have an address, they have a city, state, postal code, and so forth. But they also have this column over here called territory state. And territory state means that for this location, sample location 1, which happens to be located in Washington, they also have a service area that includes the state of Illinois. Similar here, this location is in Missouri, but they have a territory that includes the state of Wisconsin. Going further still, we have a location in Arlington, Illinois, whose territory includes Texas. Now these are kind of extreme examples where the locations are far away from their physical locations, but I'm using these so that we can easily identify locations that are being returned based on a geographic search versus a territory search. And we'll get into that a little bit more in terms of what that means after we import the data. I just want to point out that we are also indicating in these individual results that they stock or service particular products. These hypothetical products in this case are paint and ladders. We'll get to that more in just a minute. But first, what I'd like to do is actually test this or import this data file. So the first thing I'm going to do is switch back over to MetaLocator and choose Locations and then Import. Now if you have a single table setup, you might not have a locations menu. You might just see data there. Don't worry about that. The features are exactly the same. So now that I'm under Locations and Import, I'm going to choose Upload a CSV. It's worth mentioning that regardless of where this data comes from, the territory functions all work the same. In this case, I'll import that CSV that we were just looking at. MetaLocator will import it, and then it'll try to recognize every column in the system. Let's just scroll across to the right. There's one here that it doesn't quite recognize. I'm going to let it go ahead and create it as a custom field, and I'll click Next. So that will add this data to MetaLocator, and I'm actually going to wipe out anything that might already be in this account. Click Finish. So when I created that field, it created it as a text field. One of the more important things with respect to territories is that the data that the territories are stored in have to be stored in territory field types. The default field type in MetaLocator is text. That'll store basically any type of text and display it accordingly. But since we want to tell MetaLocator that this is actually a list of states, we're going to choose under field type state list. Now MetaLocator knows that it should expect territory data in that column and use it appropriately. Now that we've got the data into MetaLocator, let's just look at it briefly. If I click on sample location 2 and I go in here and I look at the custom fields, I can see that our territory state is listed right there. And so that's the idea, that's what I want to see. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to go ahead and actually geocode these results. There's a handful here that were not geocoded in my example file. I'll just let that run since it's only 3 locations. And once that's done, I will go over and make an interface. And so we won't spend too much time on interface configuration. I'm just going to choose the rich media template here. But we'll look at our individual results, and we'll see by default that they are just listed out in the order that they were imported, relatively straightforward. And even though this isn't super functional, we're going to leave it this way for just a moment. And we're going to perform a few basic searches. At this point, territories are not enabled. And so what I want to do is effectively show you a before and after of how the search changes when territories are enabled. So let's take a look at our data here. We have one location in Washington, we have one in Texas, one in Louisiana, one in Missouri, one that is in Illinois, and then one over here in New York. And so as I perform searches, for example, let's look at a zip code in Chicago, 6002, it's actually in Antioch, and perform a search there. We can see that one that gets returned. And let's look at, that's a basic geographic search. And so now notice that the sample location 1 also has a territory in Illinois. And so that location, though, sample location 1, was not returned when I searched for the zip code in Illinois. So I only saw sample location 3. So we can perform that search. We see sample location 3. Now let's turn on the territory settings by just setting enable territories to yes and click save. Now let's perform that same search again, 6002. Notice now that I have sample location 3 and sample location 1. Sample location 1 is that location way off in Washington that, according to its territory designations, services locations in Illinois as well. Now, this is what's called a geographic result, sample location 3. Sample location 1 is what's called a territory result. And so you can control how they display, in what order they display, based on options that you find in territory settings. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more. But this is a very basic example of how we have enabled territories and effectively shown how one particular location can be returned for a search that's in a geography other than its physical location, which is really the essence of territories.